tripping way too hard. Yo, what's up? It's someone that's no one, and welcome back to today's report. Today's report was sent in by an anonymous user where they took LSD, cannabis, tobacco, and codeine. And here's the full report details. Alright, here's another classic acid report. This one taking place at a night with friends, and really shows how well not to underestimate this substance and your set and setting. Having some light prior experience, this user assumed they were set up for this trip with others. And while this trip doesn't turn out bad necessarily, they do know it was a lot stronger than they expected. You'll just see. I'm sure you'll enjoy this one, so without further ado, let's dive right into this. Before I start my LSD trip report, I must preface it by mentioning something that many people don't seem to understand. LSD, in all forms, varies significantly in purity. That is to say, the crystal that is dissolved in drawdown tabs is often largely impure and therefore not as potent, especially now that LSD is so widely produced by many chemists around the world. My tabs that I bought from a friend/dealer were especially pure, as they were known as DS4 LSD, made by the Dr. Seuss team. You can look up its predecessor, DS3 LSD, and a number of reports claim that it's some of the best acid on the market. And so it stands to reason that if what I received was really DS4 acid, then it would be extremely potent. I don't remember exactly what day it was, other than the fact that it was a Saturday sometime in February. I had planned a sesh with some of my friends, a common occurrence for us as we like to smoke weed whenever we could, and we would often have get-togethers in order to do just that. This time was different for two reasons though. Reason one was that I had announced to my friends I would be taking acid. Not only that, but this time would be a whole tab, which I had never done before. Reason two was that some other friends would be joining us and they were also going to do acid, but it was both their first time taking it. In hindsight, this was probably my first mistake, seeing as how you shouldn't be guiding someone through their first acid trip on a higher dose than you ever done before, even if you think you can handle yourself. The afternoon started at about 5 when I got to my friend Jay's house. He was sitting there with his girlfriend T and my other friend O outside waiting for me. We greeted each other, and within half an hour, we were outside smoking a joint and a blunt between the three of us. T had declined to offer to smoke with us for some reason. This was my first time smoking weed in several weeks, and so needless to say, it got me very high. For the next hour or so, we just chilled in his house talking and just generally being stoned, which was fun until we realized that we should really be meeting our other friends by this point. It was now about 6, and JT and I all headed out to the train station to meet our other friends S and R. I was excited to see R as he was one of my best friends and he had moved away, so seeing him was always a special occasion. On top of this, he had only just started smoking weed and he was down to try acid with us. We met them just after 6 and we proceeded to walk into town to buy some tobacco and some alcohol for my other friends. The whole time I was still stoned, but I was still in a position to hold conversation and to act relatively normal in public. Once we had everything we needed, the 5 of us headed back to the house, meeting O's girlfriend, M, along the way. The whole of that 10-minute walk, I was convincing both S and R that acid was an amazing substance, telling them about my prior experiences and explaining all the good effects they can come to expect to experience. This was mistake number 2. I was making it seem as if LSD was a wonderful drug while downplaying all the negative things that can happen. We got back to the house and ate pizza. Before long, it was 7, and we decided that it was getting late and we should take the tabs. I presented them on the table, a half for both S and R, and a whole one for me. S and R smiled nervously and agreed, "I'll take it when you take it," with each other. They placed the tabs on their tongue, and I told them to swallow. I then looked down at my own tab. I had a sudden bad feeling that made me consider splitting it and taking 3/4. I hesitated nervously, and the fact that I could still feel the weed did not help at all. I figured, though, that I needed to take the tab soon to avoid my friends getting nervous from my hesitation. I thought in my head, and I took the tab and swallowed it. I always swallow my tabs because I can't be bothered to suck on them, and it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. On top of this, it means that if these tabs have M-bombs on it, I'm apparently less likely to trip hard because I have read somewhere how M-bombs are largely absorbed through the gums. From this point onwards, my memory of the night is very blurry, and I really can't be sure about the order of the events. About half an hour after taking the tabs, my friend S says he feels it. He starts acting weirdly, laughing at nothing, saying he feels tingling in his body and dancing strangely to the music. This was all very amusing to the rest of us, who were all encouraging him. To be honest, I wasn't that concerned. S has a low tolerance for every drug he has taken, so I realized it was probably going to be way more intense for him than it had been for my first time. But my thinking was that, as long as he wasn't having a bad trip, it was okay. Shortly after this, at about 7:40, I start feeling the acid. In all my psychedelic adventures, during the onset of the come up, there's about a 10-minute window where you can almost decide whether to trip or not. I'm probably not explaining this very well, but at the time, I was looking down at the tile floor and started to notice the flowing morphing effect happening. However, if I made an effort to focus on what I was looking at, it would stop. I asked R if he was feeling it yet, and to my disappointment, he said he wasn't. For the next half an hour, S continued to act increasingly weird, doing all of those things, but also making weird noises and saying random nonsensical things that we couldn't decipher. At about 8:10, I realized that I was starting to trip hard, harder than I had ever tripped before. I told my friends that I was okay, but that I was going to go sit in the armchair in the living room. I sat down in the armchair and got comfortable. For the next 10 minutes or so, I started tripping heavier and heavier. All the while, my friends were in the kitchen. I can see them in my peripheral vision and I could hear them. But I didn't pay attention because for some reason, it felt like they were miles away and that I was on my own. At what I reckon was about 7:30, the rest of my friends joined me and told me that they were going to go smoke weed. They asked if I was going to join them. I told Jay that I was way too high to do that, to which he replied, "Yeah, and you've got another 8 hours of this at least." This sent me into a state of panic. It was already incredibly intense, and it was only an hour and a half in. How am I going to handle the rest of this trip? I thought. The morphing and shifting was taking place on every surface I looked at, and on top of this, intricate patterns started appearing on them too. My sense of time was so distorted that it generally felt like 10 minutes had gone by, when in reality, only 1 or 2 had. This only heightened my panic as I soon realized that the 8-hour figure my friend mentioned meant absolutely nothing, and that I was going to be tripping intensely for what seemed like an eternity. For the next 20 minutes, I was on my own. It calmed me down slightly, but at one point, I started to get extremely bad vibes from being in the dark room by myself. I considered going out to join them, but I decided against that, as I felt that doing so was an impossible task and that something bad would happen if I did try it. My friends returned from smoking to find me sitting in the same chair. I later found out during the entire come up I was pretty composed, but to me it didn't seem that way. They all sat down in the living room, and O kept reassuring me that he was there and that I was just on drugs. It did not help my fear at all. He also asked me a bunch of questions. Each time I replied that I was good. I now realized that it was a thought loop I was going through, because I felt that was all I could reply with. It was probably about 9 at this point, and I asked R if he felt anything yet, and to my astonishment, he said he didn't. S by this point was barely making any sense. It was being very loud, making all sorts of noises. It was pissing me off, and I often told him to shut the fuck up, or just be quiet for 10 minutes. JT and R decided they were going to go to the shops one last time, and left me, O, and M to take care of S. I remember that shortly after this, I was able to get out of the chair again and felt a lot better. No longer panicked, but instead able to enjoy the crazy visuals. I remember that S by this point was also having a bad reaction to the acid. He would make random noises, say random things, laugh at nothing, and just generally not handle himself. I remember that at one point, he started crying all of a sudden and announced that he was going to kill himself. I tried my best to calm him down, while my other friends at the table looked at him worriedly. I also remember him saying to them, "Everything is just rainbows," to which I replied, "It just is." I remember thinking that there were rainbow lines outlining every object, but trying to picture it now is impossible. I also remember my second thought loop, where all I could say was, "I'm so fucking high." My friends returned at about 10 with their shopping. I saw R enter the room grinning. He didn't need to tell me for me to realize that he could feel it. The next few hours are a complete blur in my head, but I do recall certain trippy thoughts that happened. At one point, I was coming back from the toilet and I saw what looked like Jay leaning against the table. He was wearing a beanie and a jacket, and upon closer inspection, I realized that it was actually R. This registered in my head, but for some reason, it still seemed like Jay, even though I could clearly tell it was R. I think it was probably the similarity in their clothes which triggered this effect, but it was weird nonetheless. Around 11:30, Kane and his girlfriend decided they're going to bed. S is somewhere else, and the others are in the living room. I remember sitting at the table facing R. He was high as fuck, and so was I, but something happened that I think I'll remember for the rest of my life. I looked at him, and I swear to God I could hear his thoughts. It freaked me the fuck out, and I immediately left to go listen to my music by myself. About 1 in the morning, I decided to go out to bed, even though I realized I probably wasn't going to get much sleep for some time. I went into my room and realized I had to make the bed. I tried in vain for about 10 minutes, and it was about this time that I experienced what I think is partial ego death. I forgot how to make my bed, and not only that, I completely forgot what a bed was. It's like if someone asked me what the mattress on the floor was, I would be able to tell them it was a bed, but it would mean nothing to me. I had to ask for help, and he proceeded to make my quote for me. My ego death increased more and more. I couldn't tell what was real, as if I were in some weird simulation. I remember being confused about if I was high or not, and then thinking I was high because of weed. Then slowly, I started to get the impression that weed was somehow a figment of my imagination, and that it had never been real. I was only sure of two things. There was a physical plane on which I existed, which is why I had to lay down, and that there were other entities around me, my friends. I remember being confused about all sorts of things, like the fact that I couldn't recall whether I had parents or not, and the fact when I looked at the time, it was just a weird symbol that held absolutely no real value. During this experience, I would sometimes slip out of this state and realize that I was tripping on acid, and that none of what I was experiencing was real, but I would always slip back into my ego death. One of my thought loops during this was that I had no perception of what reality was. This continued for about an hour until I started slowly coming out of it. It was as if I was waking up and I remembered more and more things. It was about 1:30 in the morning at this point, and I ventured into the bathroom to find S just chilling in the bathtub. I told him that there was a bed he could use and that I had to use the toilet. I was still feeling the acid at this point, and I still felt that I couldn't properly comprehend time, but I did realize that I was coming down. I then joined S, and we discussed our individual experiences of what had happened. It was strange, because I could still feel the effects of the LSD, but we were able to communicate in a much more sober way. At about 3 in the morning, I realized that R was still downstairs, and we go get him to tell him that there's a bed he could sleep on. We find him on an armchair, thoroughly enjoying his music. He joined me and S, and we went upstairs. It was at this point that I really started to come down from my trip. I took about 150 milligrams of codeine to help me sleep. I really like opiates as they make me feel good, and I had planned to take them while fully tripping, but in the end, I had forgot about them. About half an hour later at 4 in the morning, I started to feel the telltale itches one gets all over their body when coming up on opiates. I remember feeling very drowsy, and my visuals seemed to get slightly more intense, although that could have been a placebo. About 20 minutes later, I fell asleep alongside R, who for some reason also had no trouble sleeping. The trip ended there, and I feel like I have learned quite a bit. Apart from anything else, I now realize how to take high doses of acid, as well as the true importance of set and setting, which I had often disregarded up until this trip. My experience of ego death also has led me to conclude that reality is whatever someone perceives it to be, and that each person's reality defines the world that they live in. I truly feel like I was in a different world when in my state of ego death, not because I was physically somewhere else, but because I was mentally somewhere else. The best part of my theory is that in a weird way, it's actually true. That's to say, even if you were to disagree with me on my views of reality, it's because you perceive the world differently, and thus live in a kind of different reality to me, where what I'm saying is not true ultimately, proving my theory.